Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Tuesday, April the 29th, 2025 session in our series on entrepreneurship in Asian high-tech industries. As always, I want to thank our member companies of the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center. Without their support, we couldn't do this series, and we're very happy that we have some refreshment afterward today. So please stay around and meet our speaker and meet each other after the formal session is over. Also, I want to say a special thanks today to the San Francisco Filipino American Chamber of Commerce for helping us get the word out about the seminar today. We also were happy to interact with STAC Silicon Valley, the Science and Technology Advisory Council of the Philippines, in regard to today's program. We're very fortunate that today, Earl Valencia, who is an old friend, good contact,
a former student of this specific class,
is coming to speak to us today about trends in the entrepreneurship ecosystem in the Philippines and really growing the kind of innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems in that part of Southeast Asia. Earl is both a serial entrepreneur, he's an investor, he's been a corporate executive, and he's had a number of senior advisory positions to the Philippine government. In 2023, he was appointed by the President of the Philippines to be an executive member of the National Innovation Council. He represents the business sector of the Philippines. Earl has done a number of things. He set up one of the Philippines' first kind of business incubator accelerators, Idea Space. And when we had you come and speak before in our series, I think you spoke specifically about Idea Space. A lot of his work has been recognized. He was recognized by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. And he has most recently co-authored a book called Venture Mindsets, or Startup Mindsets, excuse me. And so want to have Earl come and let me, if I get longer on this, it's just going to, read out your bio, which is online. So please come in and let us have your perspectives, Earl. Thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great to see you.
Really appreciate it. So again, thanks everybody for your time here. I know it's late afternoon on a Tuesday. When I was doing this seminar, there was always this conflict of like, should I do more homework? How do I rush to Professor Dasher's class? And I didn't miss any, actually, because the conversations are always very exciting and interesting. So I graduated in 2009, which it's funny. It's like, wow, how many years ago? I was literally in these seats in 2007 when I entered the GSB as a 24-year-old, new admit. And this campus was our official campus. So Bishop Auditorium is when, I got to see and meet a number of, CEOs and others during my time. So this is a very special place for me. And of course, this seminar is also a very special seminar to me, right? So today I'll talk about a number of things, but it's really talking about the innovation agenda of the country of the Philippines. But then I want each of the students here to also think about it, not necessarily specific to the Philippines, but then if you had to influence the innovation strategy of a country, what would you do? I think that is the bigger question, but that was the question that I had to think about when I accepted the role from the president of the country. Like, do I live my own merry way and hang out with my friends, or do I have to come home to the Philippines every so often and really be active in building and promoting the policies that hopefully will create an innovative country, right? So that's, I think, something that I hope all of you could think about. And that's kind of why many of you go to Stanford. At least that's kind of why I went to Stanford, right? What matters to you most and why was the Stanford Business School essay. And that was one of the things that I put in my essay, is that maybe sometime in the future, literally what I said, when I'm retired and 65, maybe I'll go back to the Philippines and be Minister of Science and Technology. Obviously, I'm not the Minister of Science and Technology, but I'm still a presidential appointee at 40. I was 40 at the time, and now I'm 42, right? So a little bit more advanced than what I put in my GSB essay, which is great. But the consistency of the why is important. And I think that's the most important thing for all of you here, especially the students, is why did you even go to this school? My kids just got into boarding school a couple of weeks ago, and I was asking the college admission counselor, like, what is the goal of these students? And they said, like, the goal is not to go to the best school, but the school that's right for you. And Stanford in particular is a school that is not just about the best academics, but hopefully shapes and makes you realize why you want to change the world, because you actually can, right? Which is an interesting thought. So, again, I'm the business sector representative of the National Innovation Council of the country of the Philippines, and I also co-authored a book called The Startup Mindsets. But a little bit of my history, because every time I'm in this seminar, this actually was my favorite slide, which is, who's this person in front of me, right? Because people will always say like, oh, wow, here's your title, but then what is the story, right? And obviously, I went to this school, so this school is part of the story, right? So I was born in LA, but I grew up in Manila, so that's Manila, most of my life. And then third year college, I went to engineering school. My goal was to do PhD in engineering, but I didn't become a PhD, right? So I went to BU in Boston for undergrad, EE. I was supposed to go to MIT for a PhD, but I declined the offer and then ended up working for Raytheon's R&D department, doing a number of classified mission defense-related things. And then I went to Cornell for aerospace engineering. And then what was a bit pivotal in my life actually was the GSB, because in 2007, they did an interesting experiment, which is, can we admit people who are in a non-traditional path or career that might not have gone to business school otherwise? So we can make this thing called the GRE exception. So in 2007, they said, what if people who just have GREs can then apply to business school without taking the GMAT? And lo and behold, I was probably one of the first admits to the GSB ever never to take the GMAT, right? So I'm like the recipient of this interesting exception, right? So after Stanford, I worked in a couple of companies, worked in Cisco, and then I ended up coming back to the Philippines at 29. And I worked for a private equity firm called First Pacific that owned the largest telecom company in the Philippines. Smart. And that's kind of where, Dr. Dasher mentioned. And I set up, as part of the deal of me coming back to the Philippines, so I met the founder of the private equity firm, and he asked me, what do you want to do in life? And the same exact why. I said, I want to be Minister of Science Technology of this country. And he laughed and said, like, nobody wants to be Minister of Science Technology of any country. But the why was also very, very good, which is like, maybe at some point in the future, I can fund ideas, the most promising ideas of this country. And he said, if you do come back from Silicon Valley, then I will make good to the promise that I'm going to give you, which is I'll fund this idea of yours. So basically, when I came back to the Philippines, made the whole pitch deck, and then he gave me about $10 or $12 million to start the first ever pre-seed and seed accelerator incubator of the country of the Philippines. And actually one of the first ones in Southeast Asia, right? So that's it. So it's called Idea Space. And then there's another program called Cuba, which is a public-private partnership of the country of the Philippines. And then I ended up working and coming back again to the US, worked in finance. So Bridgewater, which is a hedge fund, Charles Schwab, which is a large brokerage firm. I stayed in the dorm that Charles Schwab endowed. And then I came back again to the Philippines, and my co-founders here, Kevin. So Kevin and I are Filipino-American, and we said, how can we raise venture capital, fintech in general, and then maybe we can get and deploy it and change emerging markets in the Philippines, starting in the Philippines and all across emerging Southeast Asia. And we started a company called which is there in the NASDAQ there, right? We didn't go list in NASDAQ, but we were like in the incubator of NASDAQ, which is kind of cool, right? And then we sold our operating business a couple of months ago or last year, right? And then now I'm in the AI team of Microsoft, right? While doing a number of things. So it's a book, it's policy, and it's also AI in Microsoft. Perfect. So I'll start my talk with our first quote actually in the book, which is a fun one. And you didn't expect probably I'll talk about Taylor Swift in the first slide, right? But this was a quote that I thought was kind of really good to talk about because it's what was said was interesting, right? It's kind of being Taylor Swift is a performer, etc. But she said something interesting, which is being fearless isn't being 100% not fearful, but it's being terrified, but you jump anyway. And this is the spirit of the startup mindset, the spirit of entrepreneurship, and all these things, which I realize and we take for granted in Stanford that it is normal. But in probably 99% of the world, this type of mindset is so abnormal, right? If you tell your parents that, hey, by the way, like, I'm not sure if I'm gonna win, probably 99% I'm gonna lose, but I still do it anyway. Like, that is not normal, right? But in Silicon Valley, it is, right? And this is the spirit of entrepreneurship or risk-taking that we do have here. But that's the key of like, how do we actually create and be the fundamental part of why you should create a innovative culture in a country, right? Because if you have countries where most of the population says, I don't want to take risk, then there is no point of thinking about innovation, right? So this is like the formal, by the law of the Philippines, how we define innovation, right? So they have the Taylor Swift definition, I guess, right? But for example, this is how we thought about it, which is creation of new ideas that results in improved product, process, services that spread across markets. Correct. Right. But why is innovation important as a national agenda of a country, more so as a population? And the title of the talk actually is how to change a market of 110 to 120 million people. So people probably don't know, maybe some people who don't know the Philippines, but it's a country about 100 plus million people. I think it's the 16th largest country in the world by population, right? So that's the key, but it is an emerging market, right? So there's always uncertainty, and how do you then build what we call a resilient economy? And innovation is a lever of countries to make sure that they can control their future more than anything else, right? So policy is always about the strategy document or agenda. So I'll talk a little bit about what is part of this national agenda and how we thought about it and what is the priorities of a country, because it's going to be very different actually than what we'd expect of the innovation ecosystem in a place like Silicon Valley, right? So what are we hedging against? I used to work in a hedge fund, right? What are you hedging against as an emerging market, especially in the Pacific Islands, where we have the most typhoons coming into the world? We're in the Pacific Ring of Fire, and we're exposed to climate change every day, right? So this is what we call the unwanted futures. This is the risks that we are trying to mitigate. First is distress and disasters. The second one is that we can't adapt or we're slow to change. And the last one is that the inequality just continues to grow. And how do we think about this? How can innovation change that, right? So once we look about an unwanted future, we have to think about what is the right future? What is the preferred future, right? And it's basically, sorry, I read this in Filipino, but basically, like, how do you have a strong and also a stable, but also a life of prosper, right, for the country and the countrymen? So that is the goal. If you're exposing 100 plus million people to this unwanted future, how do you dream, right, of people to actually get this future that every day they don't think about these unfortunate realities that could happen to them, right? So a law was created to create innovation policies in the country called the Innovation Act of the country, which promotes growth and national competitiveness of the country, right? And what's fundamental to this is building up by law a National Innovation Council. So at some point, actually, if you guys become ministers or whatnot, or maybe senators or some policymakers, this was actually a very strategic part of the law, where by the law, the chairman of the Innovation Council is the president of the country, right? So regardless if the president of the country now and the country in the future, the president has to chair innovation. It's great. And then the vice chair is the economic development secretary, the 16 cabinet members, and 7 people like me from the private sector that can get appointed by the president to go sit into this council, right? So the council totally 25, and our goal is exactly that, right? Like, how can we ensure the future of this country through innovation, even years from now through policies, right? So where are we now in the innovation ecosystem? So this is a map of Southeast Asia. Maybe you had some other Southeast Asian speakers here before, Dr. Dasher, but generally, here's Southeast Asia, and here's the general ranking from an innovation index, right? So you have Singapore, people know, right? But then you have a number of other countries like Malaysia's here, number 2, Thailand, you have Vietnam, and then you have the Philippines, kind of in the middle, and then you have other countries here, right? So the Philippines is somewhat in the middle. And how do policymakers, and again, I'm a new policymaker, I'm like a 2-year-old policymaker, I'm a business guy typically, but I got Policy 101 in this role, right? Is what are the inputs of innovation, which is probably an important thing. And how do you build really this innovation ecosystem, right? So it's institutions, human capital, infrastructure, and market sophistication, right? And this is how it's measured there. And then the other ones are knowledge and tech outputs and creative outputs, right? So, so that's the type of like scorecard that countries are being evaluated and benchmarked against. So, in the Philippines, we're kind of in the middle. Again, we're number 5 in Southeast Asia. So we know that there's still room for improvement, and that's the goal. That's the goal of this country, right? Or this country council, right? So we build this Philippine development plan, and what's important is what's in the middle, right? So a lot of times laws are created with, what is right for the population, what is right for the market, or what's the trend outside. But one thing that we're very specific is if we focus on growing and basically creating the environment for this person in the middle, which is the entrepreneur, to help with product development, design engineering, scientific exploration, market feedback, etc., then that is the strategy, right? Because we have to, number one, create more entrepreneurs, but then build a great environment for entrepreneurs to succeed, right? And build what we call as a dynamic innovation ecosystem, which is kind of a cool buzzword. But what does it mean, right? Which is, how do we create the right culture? How do we have a platform for collaboration? How do we create capacity, from a financial capacity, but also from resources and also other support services to then help that entrepreneur? And then how do we make sure that we have this dynamic connective tissue all across the innovation ecosystem, right? So I think that's the key. But this is the slide that I want to get to, especially when I was invited by, Professor Dasher to come here, is what does innovation look like in an emerging market like the Philippines? Here is doing AI. Anyone? So a couple, right? So you have AI. The question is, what for? Right. So as I think about technology now in my policy hat, I think about what technology can actually make a dent in these 10 areas. And again, it's interesting, right? Like learning, education, health and well-being, food, finance, as in fintech before, right? Manufacturing, logistics, public administration, defense and security, energy, and the blue economy. So at least, my VC friends, and when I was a VC before, like this was definitely not my investment thesis. Right? But this is an investment thesis of a country that's building an innovation ecosystem that is right for where they are today. Right? So I had this filter. I was interviewed on TV like a couple of weeks ago, and he said, how do you think about what ideas should be prioritized? And I said, there's two filters. One is, what does the country need? And then where can the country lead? Right? So those are the two filters. It's like, what does this hundreds of million people need today? But then can you use that need to actually scale to other countries who have similar needs? So that's a type of innovation that we are trying to think about. So like everything else, there's tests. So what does the country score? And again, here's the innovation index and here's the inputs. Innovation inputs of building innovation ecosystem, which is institutions, human capital infrastructure, as I mentioned a while ago, business sophistication. And then you have the outputs, which is knowledge technology outputs and then the creative outputs. And where is the Philippines? We're literally also in the middle of the entire, 100 plus countries of the world, right? So right now it's 53, right? But then silver lining, we were 90 10 years ago, right? I guess in 2013. So that's the important thing too, is like, how do you make sure that you always think about progress and how do you build up really that ambition of like, just how do I make sure that I keep on growing and learning and then making sure that we are building forward-looking policies to set us up for the future, right? So in the first substantiation of our council actually is to hold the first ever Philippine Innovation Awards, which is a presidential level innovation awards for the country. And I actually asked some of my friends in policy in the US, like, does the president in the US there's ever an innovation medal in the US? And apparently there's none. Right? And very few countries in the world actually have a presidential level innovation award. So, to be honest, I was an entrepreneur, I was a VC, like, most entrepreneurs don't want to do awards, right? Like, it's a waste of time, rather pitch to a VC. But one thing that relates to even my book is the way that you change countries is to change mindsets, is to change culture. And actually awards, in some form of fashion actually is the quickest way to influence at a national scale. What is a culture or what is a mindset that is prioritized by the highest levels of leadership of a country, right? Which is interesting. So lo and behold, they made me chairman of this Philippine Innovation Awards, and we just we launched a couple of months ago, and then we are now doing some finalists actually just today, right? So how do we create this innovation awards, etc. So actually, I'll go through some of these slides. Actually, here's probably the most important slide. And these awards actually is also now a view or a lens. Out of the 10 priorities, what is the top 3 that we need today? What does an emerging market like the Philippines need to prioritize to tell the world what we need and what we can lead, right? So for us right now, we say these 3 parts, right? Like, how do we then help and solve through entrepreneurship and innovation, food and agribusiness or food and agriculture, food security? How do we think about building up health and well-being in a healthy country? And then how do we then think about innovation and technology through learning and education to scale the population towards these new trends like AI, right? So that's the key. And then we basically building up a whole pipeline of innovation entrepreneurs that are applying now for this award today, right? So yeah, so we're basically going to have 5 awardees that's going to be awarded by the president in October, and me, right, as the chairman of the awards, and then also 15 finalists from all over the Philippines. And why is it a big deal that we were also purposeful as policymakers that we have finalists from every, we call it the sub-region of the country. So think about it in the US, where you have maybe the East Coast, you have obviously the West Coast, you have different time zones or different areas, the South, North. And the Philippines has the same thing. And we also learned, let's say, from the US, like in Silicon Valley, right? Because in places like Silicon Valley, obviously here, most venture capital get deployed. In the Philippines, same thing. The capital is called Manila, and most of the venture capital get deployed in Manila, right? But then how do we make sure, as a policymaker, we say that you have an equal chance to potentially get an award, regardless of where you are? So analogy would be like in the US, and you tell somebody from Iowa that you have an equal chance to win the award as someone from Silicon Valley. That is national innovation policy, right? Or else people will just say, you know what, the people in Silicon Valley have an inherent advantage than me, so what's the point of innovating? That is the mindset that we're trying to break, right? And I think in the US, obviously it's market forces, people in Silicon Valley, but it's been so much of a struggle actually from policymakers, even in Washington. How do we disperse innovation in the US? So we learn from that, and we try to say in the Philippines, how do we not repeat the same mistakes in more developed countries like here, where people just want to go to one place and not build innovations of where they're from, right? So yeah, so again, the timeline is there. So we launched the application January, we're going to award in October. And it's not because of its award, but because what is the award as a vehicle towards change and innovation and mindsets of a place like the Philippines, right? So in my last slide here, it's NBA playoff season. I don't know here who watches basketball, but I grew up with this guy named Michael Jordan, who was an NBA player. There's a debate between who's the greatest of all time. Sorry, basketball fan, right? But innovation is hard. Maybe some of you are entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship is hard. Being a policymaker is hard. Everything is hard. You want to create change. But then this is a good quote that we also wrote in our book, which is, some people want it to happen. Some people wish it to happen. And that's why you are in Stanford, because you're the people that can make it happen, right? I'm lucky that I was given a chance as a non-traditional applicant, super pure R&D engineer. And then Stanford Business School said, you know what? You didn't take the GMAT, but we're going to let you in anyway, as the first admit in the history of this school, in the Stanford Business School, never to take the GMAT. And that's the why I give back to places like the Philippines, because I was given a chance to be in this institution, but I wasn't supposed to be there, right? So that's kind of my talk, and I love to hear questions from you. We can go any vector: career, entrepreneur, venture capitalist, now policy person, like corporate. I can go in many vectors and directions. Just because Stanford gave me an exciting career nonetheless. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Earl. When we sit down, we've got some time for a conversation. Go ahead.
I loved your talk.
Thank you.
Especially on the agribusiness side, I was wondering if you could speak more about the nature opportunity. I think a lot of these people in the room, even if you're working on AI, you're interested in climate. And a lot of the sort of opportunities for nature restoration and protection is in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
In particular in the Philippines. I mean, I follow the work of Wovoka Philippine. It has a local Filipino-led company. She was just a top 30, also was the Green Biz 30 under 30 award winner, 10 Dalita. And I just think that's an amazing example, but there's so many more opportunities like that in Southeast Asia. Kind of where do you see the nature opportunity?
Yeah, so there's a nature opportunity, and then there's also this notion of what's it for, right? And I think those are like the questions that we're asking, right? So there's many. So in places like the Philippines, like biodiversity is important because there's many industries that is really the direct impact of a good biodiversity. The low-hanging fruit is tourism, but then you think about not agriculture, but aquaculture, right? I mean, people don't know this, but then when I went to some place in the south of the Philippines, it's like one of the largest, if not the largest, tuna processing plants in the world. So much so that because the highest demand place of tuna is in Japan, they had planes flying from south of Philippines every day. You go from Philippines to Japan so that the Japanese can get their best tuna sashimi tonight. Right?
It's here too.
Which is interesting, right? So, because it's a 4-hour flight, so the boats come in and then there's a flight at the end of the day, which is funny. But I think that's the key, right? So the question now is, how do you then either increase the yield or protect, right? Aquaculture, right? And biodiversity. And then how do you be sure that it has, basically it has the right tools for it to sustain itself. And for me, technology is interesting, right? Particularly AI, right? Again, probably every speaker will talk about AI, Dr. Dasher, but probably not very much speaker will talk about why AI should be implemented in solving these types of problems, right? Nature, biodiversity, climate change, aquaculture, agriculture. Like these are areas where, to be honest, what's the point of having super crazy supercomputers if not to actually change and feed the world, right? So I think that's a type of mindset that I hope we can impart to many people here in the Valley.
If you all don't mind, I'd like to follow up a little bit more on some of the things that
Sure.
you were talking about, Earl. First of all, how do you see the relationship between entrepreneurship and innovation? You had the graph with the entrepreneur in the middle, right?
Of
The
course,
entrepreneurship
yeah,
in the
yeah.
middle. Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, what is innovation, right? It's basically, how do you create a positive
New ideas that
Yeah,
will really
exactly.
do something.
Yeah. Like the difference between invention and innovation, right? Is
Yeah.
innovation actually has a result. Right? Like you're trying to go from A to B and innovation takes you there. Invention can be stuck being an invention, but innovation takes it to where it's supposed to be. To be honest, hopefully it's the right market, the right need.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why entrepreneurship was there, right? Because you can talk about what's needed in the world, as policy people, as venture capitalists, but I don't know who here is a VC, right? Maybe some of you. Okay, cool. So, I used to be a VC, and the frustration I had was that you are as good as the entrepreneurs you know. Right. So as much as you can say that, oh, I am Sequoia, why do VCs try to build up their brand so much? Not because they're just cool, right? I want to build right? Because they want the best entrepreneurs to go to them.
Yeah.
Same thing with the innovation ecosystem, right? Like we just have to make sure we're able to build these entrepreneurs, but also guide these entrepreneurs of these types of priority areas. Right? Else, what will people do? Right? Regardless if you're an entrepreneur in Manila, in Jakarta, in Johannesburg, or whatnot, they're going to look in TechCrunch and copy the latest Series A or Series B startup, right? So in TechCrunch, how many TechCrunch articles will talk about the reason of why this company was built is to increase yield of agriculture by 10x because of OpenAI? I don't think I've seen any. But that's the goal of someone like me, right? Is to say, how do we get the best minds of a place like the Philippines and hopefully other parts of the world to say, let's go, right? So that's why entrepreneurship is in the middle. And that's kind of why we think that regardless of what you say, we need the people who will do it versus the people who talk about it.
Yeah. So was there some reason why the government in 2023 or so really came up with the kind of innovation focus for government policy?
I mean, there's a practical reason, and then there's also the spirit of it, right?
Sure.
I mean, one part is that every major economy in the world has to ensure the future of their country and the future of their population. And the Philippines in particular is one of the youngest countries in the world, right? About 25, 26-year-old median age, right? So how do we ensure that majority of the population that's like age 25 to 27 years old has a future that they can look up to, right?
Yeah.
And for us, that's really part of it, right? Like education is that vehicle, right? We want to excite the population. We want to tell people like, you know what? Exactly. These are like the unintended consequences, that not so good consequences that we want to mitigate. investigate and let's be part of the solution rather than that it happening to us. I think that's one part of it. And then the other one is that, ultimately we want to build, a robust business sector that's based in technology and innovation. We've observed that most emerging markets are focused on what we call as innovation. Okay, I don't want to say innovation. Industrial innovation 1.0, right?
Which is really
Yeah.
new product development.
Basically, right?
New
Correct,
product
yeah.
development.
Basically in industrial, things. Could be mining, agriculture, whatever, right? But we think that there is now, how do we then, catalyze and build this next wave of like, how do we then go to, these type of businesses and like upgrade you towards where you are in the future? Because when you are in countries, especially if you're not here in Silicon Valley, it's easy to say I'm number one in a certain category. Let's say I'm the number one in gold mining, I'm number one in fisheries, whatever. But more and more, if you're not conscious about what's happening in the world and your industry, then you actually lose when you look and zoom out. So we want to be sure that we catalyze our business sector to be sure that we are resilient.
So there's this National Innovation Council, of which you're an executive member, right?
Yeah.
On the business side. And then there's this award.
Yeah.
Right now, just to put everything in context, there are a lot of other government policies about it. We kind of name one.
No, there's a ton. Every department has. So there's Department of Agriculture has one, and science, etc.
Yeah.
But then, by the law, this is like it's a technical, interesting term, which is the highest governing body, at which the cabinet members of the other parts of the country is part of. So they might have others, but we want to be sure that this kind of body says, okay, here's the strategic policy direction.
Yeah.
You can implement what you need to do, but at least all of us can think about where we want to be as a country in this council.
Okay. So actually kind of picking up on one of the questions from Zoom.
Sure.
More on the innovation award, right? The presidential award
Sure.
for innovation. So it started last year. How's it going? What kind of applications are you getting? When's the decisions going to be made?
So I mentioned that there's 4, they're called the sub-regional. So basically the major areas of the country, the Philippines. So we just actually did our first, for the capital, Metro Manila, we basically did the first finalist actually this week in the Philippines in National Innovation Day. I have to get updated if they already picked the top 3 for this, top 3 or 4. So, and then we basically, so I think we got, it's interesting. I was very skeptical that we had people working on these quote unquote priority areas, right? Education, healthcare, food. There's even the sub 3.
Oh, okay.
It's like, who's going to work on this? But actually we're surprised. We got hundreds and hundreds of, teams apply that actually are working already on these ideas. So it reinforced our note that like, if you tell the world, you'll actually find the people that are already working on it because they also see that there's need. Right. So which is exciting. And then now we're getting, inputs from other countries and other even funds to say, hey, by the way, like, I love that you have this very specific focus areas. Like we want to help you. You have the climate tech funds, obviously like these development bank funds, like VC funds, they're all like focusing on this now, which is awesome.
So what kind of incentives come with the awards?
Yeah.
Is there any kind of, prize?
Yeah, there's some cash prize. Again, I forget how much it is specifically, right? There's cash prize, there's support from the government, they'll always promote you. But ultimately it's so I think about it as a notion of like, what's it for?
Yeah.
So when people tell me like, I don't want to apply to an award because I don't need $50,000 or $100,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
That makes sense, right? But we built the award specifically because it's a signal for you. Like imagine that like you were awarded and you were recognized by a country to say that you are the top 3 to 5 most promising innovations of a country.
Yeah.
I think that would be exciting, right? So for me, that's I think the most important part is that beyond the prizes, it's like, how do we make sure that we instill that hopefully that these people then become inspiration to younger people to say, hey, I want to be like them.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
So Earl, I know it was kind of through your introduction, but it's now 12 years ago that I was in Manila for the Slingshot MNL.
Yeah.
And I remember that after the big day of the conference, there was a startup showcase day, and there was over 130 startups.
Correct. Yeah.
That was really quite impressive. I think a lot of people don't know how much software development was going on in the Philippines. A lot of the ones that I saw 12 years ago were, okay, here's one that fits into this cubbyhole and one that fits into that cubbyhole. Were you there then? Were you at that? Were you at Slingshot MN?
Yeah, we were there.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So,
he was like super VIP, by the way, Dr. Dasher. Like he had like a
yeah.
people like
escort and everything.
Escorts and all these things. So.
But anyway, what I was going to ask is what you've seen in the subnational kind of, the people vying for this innovation award. Is it rather different from what I would have seen 12 years ago?
Yeah, I think so. So I started again when I started this, the first pre-seed seed funds of the country.
Yeah.
I realized that every emerging market goes through similar phases, regardless if it's Brazil, Philippines,
Yeah.
Africa, whatever. And what I call the first phase of innovation is about maybe it doesn't sound good, but localization, maybe it's a better term, right? How do I get something that's successful primarily in the US and then copy it and like localize it? So that is the first wave of innovation. I think that has happened. In fact, I invested in one of it's kind of like the first crypto kind of exchanges or Southeast Asia, and we exited it, etc. Right? So it was like thinking about like you have what's Coinbase or whatnot, and then how do you like have that there? So that's it. And then obviously you have the clones of an Amazon or Uber, whatever. So Grab is that, right? Which in Southeast Asia, and then you have Uber here, right? So that is the first wave of innovation. And I think now it's gone to a certain point, actually, of like, and then there's the next wave, I think, of innovation, which is how do I then build something that's maybe novel, but then for the local market, right? I realized, oh, wow, like, copy specifically from outside going in, like it's easy, but not as easy because you need to change some nuances. And now you're like maybe in different markets. So the second wave is there specific needs of the country that I can build through technology, right? Then my focus is to locally, specifically, right? So that's the next wave of innovation. And then I think this next part of innovation, which most countries in the same development bracket as the Philippines is what can we really be good at as a country now? And then how can we export our technology out rather than to localize from outside in?
Yeah.
Right? Because they realize that the market is constrained if you just localize.
Yeah.
But if you then think about it and say, hey, by the way, I'm going to be like the #1 health tech company because the Philippines produces some of the highest number of nurses in the world, and let's create some nursing related application, that'll be great, right? Or BPO, right? So it's like outsourcing industry and call centers, and how do we create, let's say, the next wave of that?
Agribusiness, like
or agribusiness, because it's a big aquaculture country. How do we pilot in the Philippines and then export it to other parts of the world, including agriculture parts of the US, for example? Right. So I think that's where the big entrepreneurial thinkers are looking now.
Yes.
And I think that's like the wave 3 that you'll probably see in the next 5 years in emerging markets, right?
So kind of another thing, we'll get to other things, 1 or 2 more for follow-up. So the outside world is changing. Like you say, everybody's talking AI.
Sure.
Right? So how does that fit into this innovation thing? Because you have to do upskilling, reskilling, that kind of thing too. How is the therapy dealing with that?
Yeah, so AI both is an opportunity and a threat to what I call as markets that are dependent on the lowest part of the value chain.
Yeah.
Right. manufacturing or let's say BPO or service, right?
Yeah.
You're the most at risk. So that is the key, right? Like there's two strategies that countries can think about. One strategy is how do I upskill the people so that they can be AI literate, if not AI ready, and then hopefully AI competent to actually build something. I think that's one. It's like the skilling part for AI. But I think that's not enough, right? My notion is that I think Silicon Valley can be the best in AI platform and tools, but it will come from the rest of the world of how we apply those tools to those markets. So I think that is the most exciting opportunity that I see.
Yeah, it's like digital transformation is 5% digital and 95% transformation.
Yeah, right. And I think I was just listening to a podcast, I think from YC or something, and then they call it like vertical AI or something. Like ultimately, we're good in the valley to build platforms, but now we have to encourage the world to build the verticals of using this and how it impacts the next wave of innovation.
Okay.
Right?
One last thing for me, and then I'll open the floor.
Sure.
So give us the tease for Startup Mindsets, the book.
Yeah. So
what's the core of it? Why should we go out and read it?
Yeah. So just FYI, it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc. Published by Penguin Random House. My co-author is here actually, Dan, who just arrived from the Philippines, but he's grew up in San Francisco. Oh yeah, that's how the book looks like. But when Dan and I observed when we were walking the streets of San Francisco, actually right before the pandemic, I thought that this notion of -1 to 0 was normal, right? -1 to 0 means that there is a point where an entrepreneur says, "I will go for it," right?
Yeah.
The point, and to be honest, everybody talks about 0 to 1, which is you decided and you're going to I need to read pre-seed, go to YC, whatever, right? Like there's so many books written about that 0 to 1. And to be honest, a lot of Stanford courses that teach you a 0 to 1. But I realized that the rest of the world, even the rest of America, so I lived in Connecticut and I visited different parts of the US, like if I tell people like, yeah, I'm going to quit my job in Wall Street and then start a company that will probably fail, they're like, no way will I do that, right? So this book basically uncovers, so we talk to mostly funded founders, but then it's series A or B below. And the question is not about how, but the question is why. Why did you do it? Because the most common insight, and maybe you don't need to buy the book, but this is also a teaser, right? But the insight that we got by talking to hundreds and hundreds of funded founders, but then series B and below, is that question is like, why did you start a company? And the next question is, if it doesn't work out, which is probably not going to work out, will you regret it?
Yeah.
And ironically, more than 90, if not 100% of the people we interviewed said, I will not regret it if I worked on a problem that was important to me. Which is exciting, right? Yeah. So that was a good insight that our book uncovered, that we kind of built around that thesis of like, how do you think about that? How do you ask yourself what is important to you? How do you then even set up yourself financially so that you could actually make that call, right? So yeah, it's basically trying to focus on that -1 to 0 decision of why you should start a company.
Oh, I bet you got some great stories in there.
I know, yeah. Definitely, right?
Okay, thanks. Your question, go ahead.
Thank you. So my question actually goes back to, you had a slide where your strategy had entrepreneurship in the middle, supported by an ecosystem, but you mentioned culture, right? That is a factor. So I was fortunate. I grew up in the Midwest. I was born in Chicago, grew up in the Midwest. My parents immigrated in the 60s from the Philippines. And my dad was an engineer, electrical engineer. My mom was a nurse. My dad had this entrepreneurial spirit, and he broke away from the standard route. But what is the Filipino government doing to foster the change in behavior of like, hey, take chances, rather than going through nursing, engineering, law, legal, right? Like that's kind of, I know we have the outsourcing BPO kind of got folks into using tech. And then I'm considering some staff augmentation for my dev teams. But what is the government doing to like change that kind of mindset exactly?
Yeah, that's why it's interesting, right?
Great
Like,
question.
so it's funny. I actually, so when they made me chair of the Innovation Awards, I was like, awards again, right? Like I built basically, when we built Idea Space, the first year we got thousands of people applying to our accelerator because we were the only one in the Philippines. We got applicants from all over the world because very few emerging market accelerators existed during that time, right? I've done awards before. But then one of the biggest lessons that we learned, at least I learned when I ran the first accelerator in an emerging market like the Philippines, is that the way you create more entrepreneurs is to show them that someone else like them has done it before. Right? And that's why this award is so important, and it's recognized by someone that their parents also, we call it the front page news effect. I don't know if you guys know this. So the hardest part, but also the most exciting part, we found out interesting phenomenon 10 years ago why. So Idea Space was backed by one of the largest private equity firms, conglomerates that invested in the Philippines, right? It's like, that time I think you met my boss before, like, I don't know, multi-billion-dollar, portfolio company. The interesting phenomenon is that some of the entrepreneurs asked me to call their parents and say, hey, can you tell my parents that I work for the Philippine telecom company? And I'm like, what's going on? Like, no, you don't work for the Philippines. I obviously.
There's startups that have gotten funded from the.
Exactly. So Philippine telecom company was an LP in my fund. And I'm like, what's happening? Because they needed what I call the cultural shielding. The cultural shielding from the people that are closest to them. But we did an experiment in the second year. It just so happened that the conglomerate also owned the two largest newspapers in the whole Philippines. And I said, what if I put these people's faces in the front page of the newspaper? Will it change the perception of their family? And guess what? There was no more phone calls for me to parents after that, right? So we kind of replicated the same thing where, like, imagine if your son or daughter says, hey, by the way, the country named me as one of the top 5 innovators of the country. Will that give them that cultural shielding? And I think it will. So that's how you do it, because it's really difficult. Right. Again, it's only in Stanford that I knew about this whole like risk and all these things. And it's normal for us because your classmates is already building a startup while you're in school. At weekends, you talk about like venture funding, YC people come here, my professor was Eric Schmidt, and he's like, yeah, who here wants to get funded? I have my venture fund. Like, everything is normal, right? But the hardest thing really, even if I came from Boston or whatnot, is if your parents say it's a bad idea, it's really hard to say you're wrong, right? So, it's a funny story. Sorry, I'm going to tell you a funny story. Kimberly, you like this story because, so I got into Stanford Business School. And it's like, my goal is to do innovation. And like, this is where Yahoo, Google came from, etc. Guess what my mom said? Why didn't you go to Harvard? Right? Like, that's where all the people I know, right? Like, so I said like, oh no, because this is perfectly where I wanna. Obviously now there's no more questions. She tells all of her friends, right? But
that's why you mentioned the school that's right for me.
Yeah.
At the beginning of your talk.
Yeah. Right. So same thing, right? So that's an interesting thing. So imagine that, right? That's just a kind of a satire, but it's a reality.
Follow-up, and this comes from Zoom. So there's an awful lot of people in the Philippines who are engaged in, say, the BPO
Oh, yeah, yeah.
sector and that kind of thing. There's going to be a lot of displacement of people who are professionals by AI.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So
It's literally what I think about every day, but okay, go ahead.
yeah, okay. No, where this can go is, what can those people use in your way of thinking about innovation that will get them through that difficult time?
So I saw this, my role before in fintech was, I was in a large financial institution, right? And, I realized, and I was already looking at AI during a time and what is the impact? And I thought, hey, by the way, if I logically explain that you should upskill yourself, you will. But then when I went to our operations and call centers, I was met with, I guess not necessarily picket, basically pickets and
Yeah.
protests, but similar to that in a very mild way, right? By nature, humans do not want change.
Yeah. We want stability.
AI is a change that then forces a lot of people to reconsider what they've been doing for the past 15 to 20 years. So the goal really here is to not actually say, hey, by the way, you'll lose your job. But the question is to think about, like, what can you do with this new tool to make your job better as a first step? And then let's have a conversation next. Because right now, if I was a call center agent, not even say Manila, but if I'm a call center agent in El Paso, Texas, I am freaking out now. And I'm thinking about, will I have a job in a year or two? And then guess what? They're going to say, those guys in Silicon Valley, like, they're the devil, right? Obviously, we want to democratize technology, but we don't necessarily think about what does it mean.
Yeah.
So it's also our responsibility in the Valley or in technology in general of shepherding people who are not necessarily Stanford grads. Right? If you go to Stanford, one of the first thing that was told to us by this guy named Andy Chen, who was the career person, he's like, the ultimate hedge is your degree. You can take risk because the worst case scenario, you can work again in a Google, whatnot, if you don't make it. But the rest of the nation, if not the rest of the world, doesn't have that luxury. So for me, that's a challenge too, right? Like as Stanford grads,
Yeah.
it's like, how do we, don't think about just like, how do we build technology? But then how do we advocate of shepherding people so that their lives get better because of technology? Right?
Yeah.
In a very practical way,
Mhm.
right? So,
Okay. Go ahead.
Question. Hi, I'm Erin. Love your book, Earl. Earl was an advisor for one of the organizations I founded, Filipinx Americans in STEAM. And I think of Christina today when you showed your timeline about the innovation rewards. She would be really proud. My question for you is reading Martin Gonzalez's book, The Bonfire Moment, and yours again last night. I'm thinking about the quote that you had about, it was like a younger entrepreneur who was crying because he said, if you fail, or if I'm more successful as an investor, if you succeed, and if you fail, then I fail, that kind of mentality.
right.
How do you encourage, I guess, young and up and coming aspiring entrepreneurs to not treat, I guess, even Silicon Valley VCs and investors, or just any investors from our community like an ATM? Because I find a lot of people not knowing the difference between, say, like a lifestyle business versus something that's venture capital backed, something that is more of Kickstarter versus something that's angel backed, like treating it as an actual business. Like, what are the numbers that we should think about? Because what I find in like a lot of our membership in our community is people are in maybe a Fang Moolah company, a big tech company, and maybe they're thinking about leaving, but then they are discouraged because, well, maybe I can't get to YC, my TAM isn't big enough, or it's either that or they're so greedy, like, oh yeah, I can just go raise money. It's really easy, and not treating it like an actual business that actually has to make money. So how do you train, I guess, whether it's Filipino Americans in the United States or even in the Philippines, the diaspora, to think that way where it's not an abundance mindset, like there's constant, like endless capital in Silicon Valley, but that you actually have to have users. You actually have to make money. I'm hearing YC now. It's like, yes, you actually have to have users and make money. You can't just get in from like clout of wherever you went to school. So that's what I think about it. I'm curious because I'm trying to find between, I guess, both of your books, like what sort of North Star metric do you have? And, you know, and then if you don't have the metrics, like 7,000 downloads on your podcast, what qualities can we pride ourselves in as Filipino and Filipino Americans as a founder when looking for investment?
Yeah, so you know, it's funny because half of the world, if not maybe 90% of the world who want venture capital don't get it, right? Probably 99%. Sorry, maybe I'm even going to be more practical, right? Like 99% of people who want VC won't get it. Interesting enough is that the 1% of people who can get VC take it for granted, right? So the thought here, that's why I would say it's a North Star, but my observation in being advisor, investor, you know, and Kevin and I founded a company, is that what's more important is the filter of like two things, right? Like, are you working on a problem that is important for the world enough that you have, not necessarily because it's TAM strategically, but then it's a TAM that many people need and need that problem solved. And then the intersection of that is, am I the right person to solve it? And I think that is the two questions that must be answered. And I think practical wise, another interesting insight, or at least reflection I have, is people who, VCs in general, or taking investments is not necessarily a success, right? Taking and, you know, basically giving part of your company is not success, right? Sometimes you need it to get to your destination, but getting it is not necessarily a destination.
In other words, fundraising, being able to raise a round is not the goal.
Correct.
This is just part of
Yeah.
the way to actually doing something for the
Correct,
world.
right? And I think
Yeah.
that's where VCs, especially now in times of a bit of uncertainty, obviously a little bit of an AI bubble, but then a little bit of uncertainty will then index to.
Yeah.
Right. So as good founders, you should be able to raise, if you have this too, right? Like you're addressing a need that is like so obvious to millions, if not billions of people, and you're the right person to solve it. In times of good, in times of bad, you will probably raise money.
Yeah.
But if you're in this hype cycle entrepreneur, then it's actually difficult when the times goes bad. Right?
But having said that, it's never easy.
It's never easy, yeah.
So
Never easy.
this reminds me, how does the Philippine diaspora fit into the whole national focus on innovation?
Yeah, it's actually part of the law, right? And that's kind of why they also got me, because I'm a quote unquote diaspora. In most markets, emerging markets in the world, and in fact, the US is a particular interesting one because, you know, we're a nation of immigrants, right? So people are from somewhere else in most parts of the US, right? It could be Europe, it could be Africa, it could be Asia, etc. Like we're all somewhat have some ancestry from somewhere else. But I think talking about mindsets, what we're trying to say is that you might not physically be able to go back to where you're from, but we hope that morally you can think about doing something to help, right? Even let's say digitally, whatnot. So I think that is the goal, because I can't necessarily convince someone who has a large number of NVIDIA stock not yet vested to basically leave and go back to Manila because they want to create an AI company, right? And that's not a good, you know, maybe it is, whatever, right? But then I wouldn't expect that. But I'm hoping that then we can convince that person to share that knowledge so that if someone needs help, then they'll be like, yeah, of course, I'll do it. Not because of me, but maybe because my grandmother or great grandmother immigrated to the US before, and that's where she was from. So that's kind of the type of thinking that we have now. It's like let's mobilize the rest of the world that has some relation to the Philippines. We actually got.
That too, you've got different stages, because maybe the first stages was plain and simple remittances going back to the Philippines.
Yes, right. But then
now
I'm
you have
talking about
more
knowledge
informal.
remittance.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Or intellectual remittance,
Yeah.
right? Is something that I want to do. In fact, so much so that it might not even be Filipino. We have a number of people that reached out to me that World War II, their grandfather was served, and then they were stationed in the Philippines. It's part of their family history, et cetera, et cetera. So we even have that interesting thing of like, so I think every country in the world should think about knowledge remittance or intellectual remittance that goes beyond financial remittance, because that's short term, but this is long term.
Well, and actually, that's been a part of Silicon Valley, not so much on an international scale,
Correct.
but the whole idea of being successful as an entrepreneur, you pay it forward, either by becoming an investor or becoming an advisor to somebody else's startup and so forth.
Correct.
That's one of the good parts of Silicon Valley culture.
Yeah, which is awesome, right?
So
I think we have like one or
go
two
ahead.
questions. Yeah.
Question on, following the remittance and bringing back to the country. You said that US is a land of immigrants, and I myself immigrated from India, for example, right? And I am very much pro about bringing it back to the country and kind of helping the government in whatsoever way that I can, or the people or students there to kind of, help innovate, right? But then for country like Philippines, or just from your perspective, what should the governments of those particular countries do to inspire people who are immigrating to kind of bring it back? Because culturally, what I see is that there are so many immigrants who come to the US or go to Europe or whatnot, they forget. And because they do kids here, and then their kids are so culturally not rooted that, they don't think about, other countries or where they came from. So what is the country or policymakers of those countries need to do in order to bring that culture of bringing it back?
Yeah, this is a great point. I was just in the San Francisco consulate yesterday. I talked to the consul general, and we had this interesting brainstorming. And one thing that we thought of, and this is part of the strategy, is you won't help someone if you don't have an emotional connection. It's just plain and simple, right? So let's say you're in India. The key is, let's say for the consulates, how do you then be the connective tissue or the short circuit between the diaspora here and then just exposing them where or what's going on to that place is there. But not necessarily move, but really just have a community or conversation around it. And I think having that alone will then push some people to say, hey, by the way, you're needed to think about agriculture. I've done a project in Google or Microsoft or Meta or OpenAI, and I think I'm interested to apply a little bit of that and advise some founders there. That's the start, right? So I think that's the goal of government, is then how do you mobilize, we call it the Department of Foreign Affairs, but in the US, Department of State, to then create that mandate of, this intellectual remittance back. And that's really how do you then use your diplomatic corps as your innovation ambassadors, rather than just talk about passports, right?
Can I comment on this? Because I followed this in different Asian economies for years.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating point. I think it has to do with how the diaspora sees opportunity in the home country. People leave, even if it's coming to the US to go to a particular university, they tend to stay out if they see the opportunities outside.
Yeah.
If they see real opportunity back home, they may see that their competitive advantage includes knowledge of home that other people may not have. We saw that big time with China. Between about 2000 and 2010, of the Chinese students who were here, who were interested in starting a business, more and more of them said they wanted to go back and do it at home.
That's right.
I've heard a lot less in recent years. Now, in India, I'm hearing in the last 10 years, really, this huge uptick in people who see opportunities in their homes and see that they can take advantage of it. I mean, if you feel like you're shut out of the system and can't get to it, you won't try to do much. So I think that the governments can provide good information, fresh information about opportunities, and also help the connections happen for people to meet people, whether it's gatherings like this or whatever. Really, I think that that could be a real powerful thing in the Philippines. Yeah, thank you. Good.
I would just like to comment on that as well, like, to what you said, that me as well, I recently quit my job 2 weeks ago in the US, and I'm now moving back to India in the next month. And I feel like, it's great that, people like me as well, like, I want to empower others, but like people like me are doing that.
Yeah.
Kind of.
So you're not just talking about it, you're doing it.
Yeah, that's great. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks for the great talk. My question is around the ROI. As you mentioned, you have been entrepreneur and investors, so we often make very data-driven decisions. I mean, for deploying and executing the strategies, like innovation strategies across the entire country, like how do you see like the ROI? Is there any way you can measure the success?
Yeah, I mean, the only measurement, so it's funny because there is the VC and entrepreneur success, and then there's the policy test, right? That's why I showed together like what policymakers look at, which is this innovation index, right? Which is benchmarking your country as an innovative destination compared to other countries. So that's how countries benchmark. Practical wise though, is that, the ROI ultimately is how much of either people from your country or your country itself attract or deploys. I mean, venture capital is not a good metric probably, but at least financial gain or value created, right? So I think that's the key. But yeah, that's why it's an interesting thing where we have to balance kind of what we have to talk about on the policy side, but then as entrepreneurs or VCs, how do you make sure that you prove that there is value created?
Good. Maybe one more question. Ed, I did see your hand early. Go ahead.
Question on fintech. The US government right now is transitioning between being crypto skeptic and considering setting up a sovereign wealth fund that would consist of crypto coins.
Sure.
How do folks in the Philippines think of crypto? And have you been involved or know of other VCs that have funded crypto fintech companies?
Yeah, so I invested in the first crypto exchange of the Philippines and we exited it, right? So
Exited
crypto,
by IPO?
so we sold it to Gojek,
Oh, okay.
right? So it's so interesting. Crypto is basically the most liquid and transnational. It wasn't intended to be that way, by the way, when we invested in this thing. Transnational store of value for most people in the world. Why? Because me and my co-founder, we tried to create a way for people, let's say from Philippines, to invest in US stocks in a very liquid way. And apparently it's very difficult. So the easiest way for someone to actually get international exposure from a dollar perspective is through crypto. And this is not unusual in the Philippines. It's probably in 100+ countries. That is the way. Because as much as we take for granted we can invest in Tesla today or Google or Microsoft, probably 90% of the world can't even access them. And the only way they can access a US related asset is through crypto. So Philippines for sure is one of the largest adopters of crypto, not because they like to do easy remittances or whatnot, which that was my thesis when I invested in this company. But it's because it is the best store of value that is not related to local currency. Right. So adoption is very high, maybe. So if there's a way that you want to do something, I think Philippines will be one of the best places for it.
So I'm afraid we're about out of time.
I know.
We have time over refreshment for those of you who are here in person. So we can talk informally outside after that. First of all, Earl, what do you think we'll see in the Philippines?
Yeah, I mean, my goal is that hopefully we find those 2, 3, 4 niches that we as a country can produce entrepreneurs that is not just copying what's happening in the Valley, but then our unique strength that we can then export to the world. That's my goal.
That's great. Thanks very much for